Welcome to day one. Now I get to take all of those crazy ideas that are floating around in my head that I put onto paper and make them into a real thing. But a saying that I've learned from my father, a military man and the first person who built one of these terrain boards for me back in the day when I was 8 years old, for my brother and I to fight our Space Marines versus Eldar, was that no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. So, with a plan, with the resources, I got to it. Today I wanted to focus on the Deadly Jungle. This board's primary use was for my gamified classes as well as general wargaming, but needed to be close as possible to a New Zealand native forest, and have a stream running through it. When under a deadline, and to get something finished, it is important to prioritise your build, and the first thing I always factor in when terrain building is drying times. In this part of the build, this mainly would be affected by the gluing of the major formations of the landscape, the rock molds that need to be made and glued overnight, and the forming of the tree. But before I started gluing, I needed to work out what this mix of ideas was going to look like in reality. So something as model makers we should always look to do first is dry fitting the major pieces and seeing what works. Now, with my massive budget of $0 dues, I'm always on the hunt for good baseboards. My school was throwing out a heap of old pinboards that were already timber framed, so I snapped these up. Being on the good side of the caretaker has its perks, and any time anyone is throwing anything away, he lets me know. What is good about these is that the framing makes these nice and strong, and they aren't too heavy as well. So first I start sketching a rough outline just to look at the proportions and the scale of things and to check my initial planning will work. And then I have a play at setting up some of the different resources that I have. The polystyrene, the 3D printing spools, some old failed prints, unused pieces of terrain from other projects, and some of them even nanas and knickknacks. Driftwood, again, this is just checking how this is going to look and if my crazy ideas are going to work. The great tree is the centrepiece, so will dominate the middle of the board, and it's going to be made out of these spools. And using some driftwood, I started to give the great tree some realistic shape, wanting it to have some massive protruding roots, which would give some interesting play dynamics, with paths through them and ways up to the tree itself. I then positioned some of these old failed 3D printing armatures to use as the lower canopy. And finally, I had a play where I wanted the cliff faces for the waterfall to be, with these two bits of polystyrene. Happy with the way this was looking, I'm ready to commit to some gluing. Onto forming the board now, and I wanted a river or stream flowing through the board. I didn't want to compromise the structural integrity of the board by digging into the pinboards themselves, so decided to build up the surrounding areas with these big pieces of packing polystyrene used to create this general form of the landscape. Here I'm building up the ground, forming and trying to make the riverbanks using all of the offcuts that I cut off the main big piece of polystyrene to make it flat. I used all of these pieces, trying not to waste anything because I don't want this to end up on the trash heap. I want it to be used and kept out of the environment. So here you can see a nice flowing river starting to take shape. A mistake I made right here was not getting rid of the angular ridges, thinking that these could be used to create interesting rock formations later in the challenge, when in actual fact they just made it awkward. This was particularly annoying on these cliff pieces. I wish I'd just carved the polystyrene into some more natural forms with less square shapes. Building up the ground form, making the riverbanks, trying to use all of the offcuts to build up the ground. Now I can start gluing, and finding some old wood glue, which I wouldn't recommend when gluing polystyrene to polystyrene, as it can take a long time to dry, and some wood glues don't react well with polystyrene, so make sure you test a piece first so you don't ruin all your work. I wanted to try and get it all to the porous pinboard, so I didn't think it would take too long when we were gluing the polystyrene to the pinboard. But making sure I'm using beads of glue so that they spread out and I'm getting maximum contact surface area, and using an old knife just to ensure that I can spread it around and make sure I get lots of contact points with the glue to make sure this is nice and strong. Here you can see I'm gluing down all the little small offcuts, again trying to always build up a more organic and natural shape. Just a reminder to always check that any of the adhesives you're using when you're particularly gluing down polystyrene, that they don't react with the polystyrene itself and cause it to melt. These can produce toxic fumes, which aren't great for your health, but worse, you could come back to your project thinking it glued overnight to find it completely pox-ridden and a melted mess, or just not glued together at all. I've always wanted some rock molds, but on a strict budget I needed to reproduce some of the awesome effects that you can get with buying molds like those from Woodland Scenics. I had seen that you can achieve this effect using tinfoil, so I thought, awesome, $3 for a roll of tinfoil. Part 1 of these DIY molds is to make a thicker tinfoil for repeated use, and boy would these get some use. You will need baking paper, tinfoil and PVA glue. Firstly, put the baking paper down to prevent wrecking your benchtop and to prevent any of the glue sticking your moulds to the table. Apply some PVA and use a brush to spread it out. You can slightly wet the brush to allow the water to water down the PVA, slightly reducing its viscosity. Key here is a thin layer that won't take too long to dry. Fold another layer over and reapply the PVA. Rinse and repeat. I went with 5 layers, which worked really well for repeated use molds. Add another layer of baking paper and weigh it down with something heavy. The big red book will do the trick. I love the 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy rulebook, and I'll leave it overnight. So, if you're ever at a loss as to what to do with the leftover spools that you have from your 3D printing projects, here is one idea. Make them into a tree. This, as I mentioned, is going to play a pivotal role in my adventurers' quests through this board, and they must ascend each level, passing a challenge to free the trapped god Tane Mahuta. I had these 3 really nice root structures that I wanted to use. I wanted these to be what anchored the tree to the board, and I used 3 spools to add additional support for the tower of filament spools, which was to come. One hobby tool that you must get is a pair of cheap garden secateurs. These are phenomenal in cutting and saving your clippers and less dangerous than a knife. They cut through plastic and popsicles so easily. So I removed some of the spool and added the first of the main trunk spools using hot glue. Having a play with the roots and happy with the way that they stack, I then quickly darted away to find my stack of 3D spools to form the main trunk of this great tree. Apologies here, I'm still learning how best to showcase what I'm doing in these tutorials, so being engrossed in my work, I forgot to move the camera. The odd things the YouTube algorithm spits at you if you don't like the right videos, or your daughter gets hold of the remote and looks up some dancing videos and craft videos, is how I discovered this odd crafting technique. This was from a few general crafty channels that had not much to do with tabletop wargaming or terrain, and that they were mainly focused around making spooky trees for Halloween. What I discovered was that tinfoil is a great material as a lightweight filler that you can shape and scrunch and bonds very easily to hot glue. Just be careful, as when you're scrunching and gluing down this tinfoil, it's unlike wood, so the heat will travel very fast through it, being a conductor, so don't press down exactly where you've glued, even though there's something between the glue and your fingers. It can be extremely hot. So here I am, using some hot glue for instant bonding, and not really worrying too much, but just trying to get some general form here, and general shapes that I want, as I'll be gluing over this in day 2. So while I was trying to think of how I could create easy to make doorways, instead of making a heap of doorways out of actual, popsicle sticks or something, I thought, how about having natural formed little caverns and make sure those are nice and black when I go to paint it, and that is where the players can sort of pop out. So that's an easy solution that I found just to make a cool doorway and make it much more natural and organic. So that's the majority of the sort of, forming done, just to take away the look of the rolls. I'm now going to work on down here, particularly try to get the roots naturally coming out. And then I've had this awesome idea to go raid the wood pile at my mother-in-law's, and again to save me some time and cost on materials, I'm going to get and basically patchwork this bark to go right round the whole thing, and hopefully in a couple of pieces, so I can take it off and the players can see the whole sort of structure. So that's the plan. Let's see how it goes. Now, I can't overstate this enough. Root structures are the best part of a small tree or shrub for realistic and far more durable tree armatures. I learned this technique from observing one of the Sylvaneth displays on one of my pilgrimages to Warhammer World. They are pretty hard to remove from the ground, so you have to do a fair bit of digging, and you want to preserve as much of the structure as possible. These ones I'm using here are a couple of years old, and I've repurposed them for this project. They have seen heavy use and still have their awesome shape with very little breaking off over time. The very nature of roots needing to be more strong and flexible than the trunks and branches makes them awesome for tabletop forests. For these, I used a combination of hot glue to get that instant bond and a lot of liquid nails to get that superior lasting hold, and this would cure overnight. I also used small pieces of bark to help create a larger surface area for the root structures to be secured, and they also gave some interesting texture, made the top of the tree much more organic and natural looking. So I've got the top looking how I want it, and the sort of whole profile of the trees coming together. And now I'll just let all that set. Lots of liquid nails in there just to make sure that that holds. A lot of glue, hot glue, just to secure it in place while the liquid nail sets. So that is the great kauri tree, which is inspired by the great Deku tree of Zelda, and will embody Tane Mahuta in the game universe I'm creating. So it's the end of day one of my 2-week challenge of building 2 battle boards before the start of term 3. Pretty productive day. I'm very happy. Got the bulk of the tree done, which was my biggest concern of it actually working and piecing together all those wacky ideas inside my head. Awesome that I've found a use for all these unused 3D printing spools, which is really cool. And I've got the main form of the jungle board all sorted, so let that all dry overnight. I'm going to go on a little quick adventure to get some more bark so I can get this looking as epic and realistic as possible. And my idea is to see if I can not magnetize that on so I can get them on and off, so the players in the game can see where their characters are when they go inside the tree. So on to day 2, and let's hope it's as productive as today. See you there. See you in day 2 of the Epic Terrain Build Challenge.